coming back to the obesity, type 2 diabetics, insulin, which, somebody who is overweight or obese is going to have insulin resistance. And that is basically a synonym for having too much insulin in the body, hyperinsulinemia. So what I'm getting at here is they also have this other factor if they're type 2 diabetic and injecting insulin, where they're now throwing more wood on the fire. So basically, they're going to make themselves gain more weight because they're taking in more insulin, which is a growth factor. Plus, it's going to make, it's going to be a growth factor for cancer as well. So you can just see how all this ties together. And for somebody in that state where they're overweight, obese, type 2 diabetic, injecting insulin, like everything's just cycling against them at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And the idea that you should treat type 2 diabetes with insulin, it had its heyday sort of in the 90s, 2000s. People thought, hey, just give more insulin to get those blood sugars down and then you'll do better. That idea has sort of gone away. There was a couple of large studies in 2008 that really sort of put a hole in this idea that giving insulin was like great medicine. So, and the risk of cancer was always a concern in that case. But again, there's a lot of other issues there. The weight gain, of course, was the most visible problem of that, right? And that whole thing, I talked about it in the diabetes code as well, in type 2 diabetes, you have too much insulin. Insulin levels are too high, so why would you give more? It doesn't make any sense at all. It's actually the wrong thing. And people knew it because you take insulin, you gain weight. As you gain weight, your type 2 diabetes got worse. As your type 2 diabetes got worse, you had to take more insulin, which made you gain more weight. You can see how that's not going to end well.
So for somebody that is in that boat, what do you recommend to them?
I think that the best thing is really to sort of focus on the diet. So in terms of diet, there's, some general principles that are pretty well accepted. One, try to eat natural foods, right? Don't try to eat a lot of processed foods. Try and cut down the sugar. And then to me, it's also don't eat all the time, right? In other words, make sure you have an adequate period of fasting in between because, it's a balance between, insulin, nutrition, being good and then letting your body use that. But from a cancer standpoint, it's a lot harder to measure. Like even these things about insulin causing cancer growth, there's a theoretical risk, but because the risk is spread over like 20 years and even if you gave somebody a lot of insulin, like these type 1 diabetics who would get it at age 10 sort of thing, it's hard to show because they don't get cancer until they're sort of like 60, right? So studies generally are not in the long term. Nobody studies people over that length of time because it's just insanely expensive to follow people for 40 years. But it's a factor. Like it's a huge factor.
And in the research, have they found any cancers that are immune to this insulin response?
Not all cancers show that risk. So it's mostly the obesity-associated cancers. Like lung cancer, insulin plays very, very little role in lung cancer, whereas breast cancer and colorectal cancer it plays a big role. And other ones are moderate. So pancreatic cancer, it plays a big role. The interesting part about the obesity-associated cancers is that they've become a bigger and bigger problem in the last 20 years. So whereas the number one cancer in the world has always been lung cancer, it's becoming relatively less important because smoking rates are going down. We're actually starting to see a lot of non-smoking associated lung cancer, and nobody knows why that is, but it's definitely a thing. We're starting to see this all the time now, which is super strange. So there's more to this story, but the rates of obesity-associated cancers are going up and up and up. The only one of the obesity-associated cancers that where mortality has gone down is colorectal, and a lot of people think that's because of the catching it earlier, like the screening colonoscopy, which again, they've recently pushed it back earlier. So instead of age 50, they've actually started to push it to 45 because we're seeing earlier and more aggressive cancers. And the thing is that cancer is an extremely complex topic. So it's not just one thing generally that affects it. So yes, genetics can play a big role, but so can other things, right? So you don't have to be overweight or obese to have breast or colorectal cancer. Many people get it who don't have that risk factor. It's a risk factor. It's a number of things that altogether create your risk. And it's the same for anything. It's like heart disease. The risk of heart disease is not related to one thing. It's related to age, it's related to sex, it's related to family history, it's related to smoking, it's related to weight, it's related to physical activity, it's related to stress, right? There's like 10 things that are risk factors for cardiovascular disease. It's going to be the same for that, right? So whereas it's important to focus on these, it's not the only thing. So, the last thing I want to see is sort of people saying, "Oh, you have breast cancer. You didn't eat right." And that's not the case. Same thing with lung cancer. Now we're starting to see a lot of lung cancer that's not smoking associated. So this sort of blame game, which I see a lot of sometimes, is on social media. It's quite destructive, right? It's not, as a physician, that's not what you ever want to be doing, right? You just want to treat people, make them better. You don't need to blame people for stuff.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
These studies have been replicated over and over and over for the last 30 years of attributable risk. And diet and obesity is that second huge bucket, and nobody's talking about it.